Once an adult suspect has waived his Fifth Amendment Miranda rights to silence and to counsel, it's pretty clear that officers can continue the interrogation until there is an unambiguous invocation of the right to silence or counsel. But does this rule apply the same way as it does to an adult when it comes to juveniles? Well, that was the question that was raised in a recent California Supreme Court decision called People v. Nelson. And when this case gets to the California Supreme Court, the juvenile argues that he had invoked his right to silence and counsel, and that, unlike with adults, even though it may not have been the clearest of invocations, unlike with adults, when it comes to juveniles, you can take into account all these other factors, like the juvenile's age, experience, education, background, intelligence, whether he has to speak to a parent, whether or not he had the intelligence or capacity to understand the warnings given to him and the consequences of waiving his rights. Basically, he's arguing that, hey, even if the invocation was ambiguous, if you can take into account all these factors, and you can still find that there was an invocation that would require the officers to stop. But the California Supreme Court said no. Hey, these factors, they said, they are relevant in deciding whether or not someone initially gives a knowing, intelligent, and voluntary waiver. But that rule doesn't apply to post-waiver invocations. They said once the juvenile waived his Miranda rights, whether he will later be deemed to have invoked those rights is based on the same rule that applies when it comes to adults. Is the invocation unambiguous? In other words, would a reasonable officer interpret the words as an invocation? Now, the court then looked at the various statements that the juvenile was claiming were invocations. The juvenile, who was just 15, had been arrested on suspicion of murder and burglarizing several homes. And the investigators, after they arrested him, they advised him of his Miranda rights, both the right to counsel and the right to silence, at the onset of the interrogation. And it was clear that he had made a voluntary, intelligent, and knowing waiver. Now, after he made that knowing and intelligent and voluntary waiver, he then claimed that a bunch of his statements, as I indicated before, were invocations of either his right to silence or his right to counsel. Now, the first statement he said invoked his rights was that he had asked to call his mother. Now, when he asked to call his mother, the investigator asked why did he want to make that call, and he explained he just wanted to let her know what was happening and to talk to her about it and see what he should do. The investigators continued interrogating the juvenile. As they continued to interrogate the juvenile once again made several more requests to call his mother, and in fact, he was permitted to try and reach her. Now, he couldn't contact his mom, but he did call and speak to his grandmother and his brother, and the court found that even though the juvenile had requested to speak to his parent, the fact that he was requesting to speak to his parent was not a presumptive invocation of his Fifth Amendment rights. They also said the juvenile didn't say or do anything before or immediately after he asked to speak to his mother, indicating he wanted an attorney or that he no longer wished to talk. To the contrary, he clarified that he wanted to let his mom know what was going on and where he was. So that first request to speak, or even multiple requests to speak to his mom, was not deemed an unambiguous invocation of either his right to counsel or his right to silence. The juvenile also claimed that he had invoked when he declined to take a polygraph test because his relatives had told him on the phone they didn't want him to take a polygraph test until they got there or an attorney or his mother arrived. This was also not held to be an unambiguous invocation because a reasonable officer could interpret this simply as reluctance to take a polygraph test without first speaking to his mother or as an attorney. A conditional invocation of the right to counsel that's limited just to the administration of the polygraph, that is not an overall invocation requiring the officers to stop their interview. Questioning doesn't have to halt just because a suspect refuses to take a polygraph. Third, at some point, the juvenile said he didn't care who might be caught for the victim's murder as long as you guys leave me alone. And the court said this wasn't an unambiguous assertion of his right to silence either. I mean, a reasonable officer in those circumstances could view the statement as basically a simple expression of frustration with the investigator's repeated refusal to accept his denial of guilt for the murder. He had been denying it up to that point. Finally, toward the end of the interview, investigators asked the juvenile to write down his feelings. They left. When they come back, the juvenile said, well, he hadn't written down anything, and asked, do you think I could be left alone until my family gets here? They should be here in about 10 minutes or so. The investigators tell the juvenile that they were tired of, basically his playing games. And they said to him, look, take this opportunity to say what happened in your own words, and then they left the room once more. He then writes out a statement admitting his guilt of the murder. And the court found this wasn't a clear invocation of his rights to remain silent either. Just because he asked to be left alone for a little while doesn't mean he's invoking his right to silence or his right to counsel. At least it wasn't an unambiguous invocation. So none of the statements of the juvenile were unambiguous invocations, and therefore all his statements should have been and were properly admitted at trial.